Well, it's so good to see everybody. It's so good to be here, hanging out with y'all on this auspicious day, right? The summer solstice. 14 hours, 34 minutes, and 37 seconds of light. One more second than yesterday, and tomorrow we'll have 2 less seconds of daylight. So there's plenty of light to light this Dharma talk. And I want to welcome everybody. It's so good to see all the local Sangha. I'm sure you're excited to be able to come in here and share. And definitely everyone online. Yeah, it's funny, I always get choked up. My mom is online, so it's very, very cool that she's online. And then I want to thank Roshi Joan. She sort of opened the Dharma to me, and it's wonderful to be here and sharing in the space she created. And I'm excited for all the residents. I love sharing the mornings with each one of you. And you're off to Prajna tomorrow to share the weekend with Roshi and those beautiful mountains up there. So thanks for having me today. So what I'm talking about today is stepping into the turbulence, our walk with fear. Sometime back, I was doing practice interviews. I was in the office over there, and someone walks in, and they bow, and they say their name. My practice is sitting with fear. How do I sit with fear? So we talked, bowed out. And I really didn't think about the encounter until this past January when I was up on a windy, snow-swept mountain peak in Colorado. And I had gone there with some friends of mine, my closest friends, my best friends. And we would always meet up for these amazing trips, right? And this one was to go backcountry skiing up in Colorado, skinning. Does everybody know what skinning is? It's where you sort of put a carpet on the bottom of a ski, so to speak, and you can go up the hill, and it allows it so that the ski won't go backwards. And then you get to the top, you peel the skins off, and you can ski. So we all met in Silverton, and we were just across the valley from Silverton ski area. We're about 9,000 feet, and our goal was to get to the top of this peak that was at 12,500. And my best friends and I, we sort of always, again, we gathered together because of these sort of crazy things that we would do together. And I'm like 10 to 15 years older than them, but we'd always been able to hang out, and many times I would push them, and we were all very competitive. And so, this was one of those days when it was super cold, the visibility was really low, and we took off. And it was like trudging up this mountain, right? Switchback after switchback. And it's the first time I really remembered struggling, like deeply struggling up this hill and in front of my friends. And certainly I was a little stressed out about the fact that I was probably slowing them down. And I also was a little bit of embarrassed about my abilities in front of my best friends. So we finally get to the top, and I feel like, yeah, I can do this, I can make it. And the wind is just whirling, the snow is like pelting us, and the visibility is very low, and we're standing at the top of this head wall, which is where you sort of drop down a steep embankment, and you'll wind up going into this bowl and on down. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, my legs are aching. I don't even know if I can make it down this hill. And my friends are hooting and hollering, like they just can't wait to drop this head wall. And I can feel fear lurking, feel the fear going through my exhausted muscles and my ego. And one by one, my friends dropped and off they went. And I'm standing there sort of staring into oblivion. And obviously you can see I made it. But prior to that weekend, I had really always sort of perceived myself as someone who really wasn't fear-based. And, I grew up in a family that we weren't really fear-based. My mom was a pilot. We would go winter camping. I mean, we just did all sorts of crazy things. My parents weren't warners. They didn't tell you, oh, be careful or anything like that. They'd throw you in and see what happens. So, of course, I've had fear, but that weekend I really sensed that I felt it. And so, and it wasn't really about dropping into the bowl, so to speak, the fear of like the athletic side of it. It was really fear about loss of vitality, the thing that kept me connected to my best friends. So after that experience in Colorado, I drove home and I was like really thinking about fear. I sat in Zendo quite often thinking about fear, like trying to uncover the fears that are present in my life. Do I have the right answers? Am I a good attorney? Do I know enough about Zen? All these questions that come up. Am I okay? Do I love enough? Am I in the right spot in my life? Is life escaping me? All those questions that come up. I thought of the person who came into the practice interview and said they sit with fear, and that person's story. And I've talked with many of you, and you've shared your stories, and you've shared your fears. And when I hear all of that, I think, wow, fear is so alive for all of us. It's so alive. If you think about it right now, how is fear alive for you right this moment? Now, tonight I'm not talking about warranted fear, that fear that causes flight or flight. One time I was in Chicago, I got mugged at gunpoint. I could tell the guy wasn't really happy with the amount of money I put in his hand. And all I could think of was like, wow, it'd be really a bummer to die over $2.44. And so when he said run, I ran. Now that was a bit of fear. And I know that all of you have probably had experiences where you've been through horrendous fear. And certainly the notion of just breathe or take a breath, or even my Dharma talk, those things might not be of much help. But I feel if you're listening to my words right now, that somehow you've come through the other side. And while fear may not be a welcomed emotion, certainly it's something that can be of service. So what I am talking about are those fears that we carry with us every single day. Fears about change, fears about losing our identity, losing our friendships, thoughts about what others will think, afraid we won't fit in. So we might buy the things that make us feel like we think we are, the right clothes, the right car, the right house in the right location, everything that sort of supports us in our fears. We may pick careers that are based on what our parents think or based on what others think. We have fears that our relationships might end. That's a big one. I deal with, divorces every day. So all those fears that come out around the divorce and around the future after the divorce. We have all the fears that we won't reach our potential. That's a big one. That we've lived vicariously through others, or we haven't been present for others, or have just wasted parts of our lives. We have all those fears of the finances, fears of politics, fears of the climate. We could go on and on. It's like Kozan last week talking about the delusions are inexhaustible. We could go on and on. So many fears we hold. Think about those fears that you hold. And think of the Buddha. Can you imagine his leave taking? The Buddha left his wife He left his son. He left the pleasures of the palace. I mean, consider leaving something that you love, something that you really cherish. I can imagine the doubt and fear that the Buddha must have felt when he was doing this. And then, as you know, he basically entered a life of austerity, the ascetic life, and sitting to the point where he nearly dies. I mean, nearly dies sitting by the river until somebody comes along and feeds him some gruel. And all of this experience of the Buddha helped him understand the facts of life that sort of underscore and undergird so many of the fears that we have in life. You know, we'll get old, we can't escape aging. We'll get sick, we can't escape sickness. We'll die, and we certainly can't escape death. And outside of that one, the one that always gets me is that we'll lose all that is dear to us, like everything and everyone. You know, every meeting is a departure. And you know, these are Buddha's 5 remembrances, or at least part of them. So it's no surprise to think when fear creeps in, when we think about what we ourselves don't want to happen in the future, or you know, like avoiding aging and death, or losing what is dear to us, or wanting to change the past. How often we do that. And then think for a moment. Think of all the actions that we take, all that we do to avoid fear, to bypass fear, to make decisions out of fear that really don't serve us. I mean, can you imagine how many times, if you really started to calculate, you've made decisions out of fear? It happens all the time. And what happens when we do this? Any guesses?
End up regretting.
We regret, and that's more suffering. Yeah, we suffer more. So the first noble truth about suffering is certainly true. We really do suffer, especially because of our fears. And why does this happen? Well, fear is one of those things that clouds the emotions and causes us to do things that really don't serve us well. But Roshi, she's given us one thing to think about. You know, fear is also a doorway to the most interesting place for our practice to do its work. A place where we are at a threshold we need to explore. If we avoid it, more suffering will occur and deeper fears will take hold. So our quest is determining how our fears can support our life. How can our fears support our life? You know, how can fear be our ally? You know, how can we really listen to fear and actually hear it? So this past February, a bunch of us that are sitting in this room went with Roshi to Chiapas, and we went with Alonso Mendez. And you probably remember Alonso from 3 weeks ago. He was part of Planting Life. And yeah, that was an amazing deep dive into the Maya world, in Palenque and Yaxchitlan, and swimming in the Ozo-Motley River between Mexico and Guatemala. Anyway, part of the journey, Alonso took us to these amazing waterfalls. And the waterfalls are, you know, flowing sort of down like this into these deep, beautiful pools. And it's pure white water going over the face of these falls. And it was calcium buildup over thousands of years that would create the sort of rolling part of it. And so we're all admiring the beauty of the waterfalls. And Alonso's like, let's walk down the falls. And we're all like looking at each other going, what? Like walk down the falls? It's one thing to look at the falls. It's certainly another thing to think about getting in them. So, you know, we're wearing our bathing suits and we have our shoes on and we're trusting Alonzo, and we take some steps into the water. And Alonzo's right in front of me, and there's a row of people behind me. And I can see some fear on some faces behind me. And Alonzo smiles and he says, step into the turbulence. He's like, where the water is turbulent, no moss grows, and it's more sure-footed. Because moss was growing in the calmer spots, and you'd certainly slip and tumble all the way down these falls. You weren't going to stop yourself, and you'd land into these pools if you made it. So I thought about this, hearing these words. Something in me sort of woke up. It seemed like a paradox of sorts. Where the water is most turbulent, there is also this assistance, this cleansing power that clears the moss. And so with each step into the turbulence, trusting ourselves, step by step, sure enough, we made it. We made it down the falls and we dove into the bottom. And it was beautiful. So, I love this metaphor of stepping into the turbulence, because the seeming obstructions, obstacles, troubles, fears, ding, 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 our fears can be auspicious. This word comes from the jewel mirror. Complications are auspicious. Do not resist them. Do not resist your fears. And it's fear that we usually want to avoid. Yet, when we lean into it, when we step into it, when we pierce it, so to speak, it has an energy. And it's the kind of energy that can help us see more rightly. And then we can use it and transform. The Buddha talked about right understanding and right seeing, which is wisdom. There is wisdom in fear, especially if you look at it and you look for it. And this leads naturally to a kind of strength and understanding that can carry us forward. So again, the Buddha, having left his wife, his son, his home, this palace, the comforts of the palace, nearly dying, he sits consistently in determination under the Bodhi tree when Mara, and you remember Mara's like the devil. Mara comes to tempt Buddha. And the reason for this is, Mara was a bit jealous of the path that the Buddha was on and trying to achieve enlightenment. So Mara comes to tempt the Buddha with fears of death, fears of failure, of being alone. Yet in the midst of his fears and in the midst of the turbulence, so to speak, the Buddha remained centered, undistracted. He's not swayed by Mara's temptations, not swayed by all the fears, all the doubts that could hold him back on his path of enlightenment. In fact, the Buddha recognized that Mara's temptations and all the fear and all the doubt were actually projections of his own mind. This is big. Do you hear this? The Buddha recognized that fear was a projection of his own mind. And isn't it so often that we think of fear as like some bugaboo out there? And it, excuse me, and it could be out there. There could be danger out there. But most of the time, it's right here. It's a product of our own mind. Now, of course, we have to have the presence of discernment to clear up how we address fear. Peace out, I don't have this, or I totally got this, right? Even though it's fearful, despite the fear, I've got this. Shantideva, who we studied, I think last year or the year before, the 8th century Buddhist monk, he said that all fear arises from the mind alone. All fear arises from the mind alone. So the mind is so powerful. Natalie, one of our local Sangha members, Natalie, in her book, The Great Failure, she wrote, "How can anyone survive if the way is so splintered? What we learn is it's whole, been whole all along. It is our perception that is broken and that creates a shattered world. But each of us has to discover this in our own lives. That is what is so hard." So you see, our minds can clearly get in the way. Our broken perceptions, our projections. Does your mind get in the way? I know mine does. So some of you may know that for about a decade, I worked in the ER at St. Vincent's as a crisis counselor here in Santa Fe. And I was primarily attached to the ER, but sometimes I would be called up on the floors. And one day I got called in to go to the surgical unit. And I went up there and I walked into the surgical waiting room, and the room was just packed with people. And I'm greeted by Sharon. And Sharon said that her father, Tim, who was 72 years old, had come in for a routine, if you can call it routine, a routine heart procedure. And he had been through this procedure before and made it. I mean, everything was just fine. So Sharon and her sister came and they sat with their father in the surgical waiting room and, just comforted him, held his hand, told him everything would be okay. Don't be afraid. And Tim had been fairly quiet. And then as time went on, all of a sudden, Tim's like, "Get all the kids." He's like, "I'm not making it." And this was a very large family. Like Sharon had 8 siblings. So there were 9 kids that Tim had. And Sharon and her sister, they're like, "Oh, Dad, you've been through this before. You're going to be just fine. Don't worry. Be strong. You'll be fine." He's like, "Nope, get all the kids. I'm not making it." So Sharon and her sister, they went out and they called all their siblings, and one by one, they start to trickle in. And he's in his bed in the prep room in the surgery, Tim is. And one by one, all of the siblings, all of his children come around. And finally, the last sibling shows up. And then Tim, one by one, he's like, "I love you. I'm proud of you. If I did anything to hurt you, I'm sorry." Each one, "I love you. I'm proud of you. If I did anything to hurt you, I'm sorry." And, they're all doing what the kids will do. They're going to say, "Dad, you're going to be fine. Don't worry." Well, Tim went into surgery and he didn't make it. So Sharon's in front of me and she's weeping and she's telling me this story. And all of her siblings are in the back of the waiting room. And she's like, "God, I just told my dad, he just needs to be strong." And I looked at her and I said, "Sharon, your dad is as strong as any of us can hope to be in a situation like that." He understood that his life was coming to an end and he did exactly what he needed to do. We can't hope to be any stronger. Now, I certainly don't know what Tim was thinking. I can only imagine what a scary prospect it would be to be cognizant and say goodbye to your life, say goodbye to your loved ones. So I can't know what he thought. I only know what his daughter said, "Be strong." And who said that we have to succeed as though it were a matter of winning, triumphing, fixing? For Tim, I think it was a matter of, bearing witness with grace and heart. Grace and heart bolstered by understanding. That's what it seems like Tim did. He stepped into the turbulence the fear of his own death, and he did what was essential. So what is it in our mind that hinders the possibility for us to see clearly? The Buddha tells us in the Second Noble Truth, that in the truth of the cause of suffering, that it's our craving, our clinging, our ego nature. It wants to hold on to what it perceives it has, endless life, our loved ones, power, vitality, our reputation, and avoid what it fears. What is distasteful in life. All those things we don't want to let go. And all of this fuels our fears as we become attached to our comfort zones, our beliefs, our identities. And even our joys, says the Buddha, if we cling to them, will create a kind of suffering and a kind of fear of loss. And this is where our practice is so essential and can be of such great assistance. The chance to be with the nature of our mind, that threshold we need to explore, as Roshi tells us. When the Buddha encountered Mara and recognized Mara's temptations, and that the fear and the doubt that was all around him were actually projections of his mind, what did he do? That's true, he touched the earth. But he thought of his strengths. He thought of his ability. I have faith. I have energy. I have wisdom. And Mara was gone. Our fears can be lurking, even lurking around the corner. But immediately with fear present, there's a kind of grounding, a kind of support that wants to arise right there with fear. Because when I think of my own fears, do I have the right answer in this Dharma talk? Will I have the right answer tomorrow morning when I see my next client? As soon as I have those kinds of thoughts, I remember why I'm here. I'm here to serve. I'm here to grow, to learn, to serve. That's the key. And this is such an interesting antidote that ensues in the midst of my doubt that I don't have the right answer. And it's in this moment, we're not bypassing, we're not avoiding, but we're in the mind space where we can catch ourselves and shift. Catch yourself and shift. I got this. And we can even shift by minor degrees, because a minor shift can be major movement. And we're not taken by our fears. We're not consumed by our fears. It's really important. And for those of you that participated in the Varela Symposium, we talk about the neuroplasticity of the brain. And in the face of certain behaviors, one of them being fear, when we are different in the response, already we create new pathways in our brain that our brain and our body can adopt, new understandings, and actually new ways of being. So we can have newfound understanding that things don't have the grip on us that we imagine they have. And it sort of takes us out of the struggle. And the natural corollary to this is first to be nourished ourselves, and second, to nourish others. And you remember a few weeks ago during Cato's Dharma talk, he talked about, planting the seed within you, right? And harvesting that seed. And what were the last 3 words of his Dharma talk? Do you remember? What you do with your harvest? You give it away. Exactly. We help end suffering. That's what our practice is all about. So back in Mexico, Cato, Kodo, and I did a temazcal, a sweat, and we did it with a Oaxacan shaman. And we're in this super dark sweat lodge, except for the coals. You know, they weren't coals; they were volcanic rocks, and they're glowing so brightly. And the shaman gets into this incantation. Haz el miedo tu mejor amigo. Haz el miedo tu mejor amigo. Make fear your best friend. You know, make fear your best friend. I don't think you need to make fear your best friend, but certainly make fear a friend. And you know, we learn, interestingly enough, from Thich Nhat Hanh that when the Buddha encountered Mara, he would say, "Hello, old friend. I know you." And again, Mara was gone. So make fear a friend. How are we doing on time? Oh, I got lots of time. Well, so I have some thoughts now that will pull some of this together. But I can't get away from stories. But I'll ground us a little bit. So one of the things I love to cover in Dharma talks is that chant we say almost every day. We said it this morning, the Heart Sutra. And there are some lines with regard to fear that have always intrigued me. And you'll remember this. Those who help all to awaken, abide in the realization of wisdom beyond wisdom, and live with an unhindered mind. Without hindrance, the mind has no fear. Without hindrance, the mind has no fear. What could it mean to be without hindrance? I think I've seen it. So recently, I was at this jazz performance. You know, I always love to talk about music. Anyway, I was at this jazz performance, and I've gone a number of times to see this trio, a piano player, an upright bass player, and a drummer. But this night, they had a fourth player there, and a xylophone player, a very young xylophone player. And, you know, he was standing there before the audience and looking very uncomfortable. And I'm, you know, this is my own projection, but he seemed really scared. Like fear was sort of exuding out of him as he was waiting to start. And, you know, everybody at our table was like, yeah, he looks scared. But as soon as they started playing that West Coast jazz, I mean, fear, if there was any fear in him, it just fell away. I mean, he fell back so deeply into the moment. I mean, his face was awake and present. His passion seemed to be flowing. And he was one with every single note that was coming with every strike of his mallet. And that's where I thought, is this what an unhindered mind looks like? I mean, and can you imagine it? Imagine what this young musician thought in all of those moments, waiting for the music to start. All that waiting, you know, do I have this? Am I going to remember the notes? Am I going to, you know, forget the music? Will the audience like me? You know, will they have me back? And all of this while waiting to strike the mallets in the way that I'm sure he knew that he could, right? And in the space between all of that waiting and that first strike of the mallet, I can imagine the mind moving with fear to making music. And it's in that moment, there's this kind of assistance, this assistance that I've been talking about, a great assistance from his clarity and his practice. And these are the thoughts that show up through fear that can ground us and support us. Remember the Buddha's thoughts during his fear. his strengths. You know, I have faith, I have energy, I have wisdom. Roshi likes to say that pain is comprised of non-pain elements. So could it be that fear, that amid fear, there are non-fear elements that support us? How do we recognize this? Let the fear that all of us face every single day get us to this place where we can recognize. So we're not grabbing onto all of those things that don't belong to who we really are. You know, do I have the right words? Am I Buddhist enough? Am I smart enough, strong enough? You know, forget all of this. These are just projections of the mind, and they're not grounded. I invite you to trust that part of you that already knows all of this. Like, trust that part of you. And when we do this, we show up. We find our gifts and how to share them with the world. You know, doing the small things, as Mother Teresa says, with big heart. You know, doing the small things with big heart. That's enough. That's enough. Thank you for this shared practice.